Obrigado. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being here. And let's do our job. As we all know, there are different ways of seeing the past. Depending on the principle governing the particular way we choose to see it, the results will be different. When we talk about the history of Brazilian literature, for instance, we can, amongst other options, either situate it within a wider selection of texts, both temporally and geographically, an approach which characterizes it as one of the manifestations of a legacy that dates back to the origins of Latin culture, or situate it within a more restricted selection, beginning in the 19th century and relating only to Portugal. In whichever case, the very delineation of the meaning of what we refer to as Brazilian literature will also be a consequence of the principle used to define it. And as we know, as a form of discourse, history itself is constructed from principles or premises that are not always visible to those who produce it. If we begin with a wider point of view, temporally and geographically speaking, that is, with the approach that emphasizes the long-term derivation of Brazilian literature in relation to a previous legacy, then we can speak about a Latin legacy, and consequently a European one. One example often cited here in Europe of the valorization of the Latin legacy is the book European Literature and the Latin Middle Ages by Ernest Hubert Curtius, originally published in 1948. In this book, Curtius contends that, although no period of the history of European literature has been so little known or studied as Latin literature of the High and Low Middle Ages, a historical vision of Europe makes it clear that it is precisely this period as the link between the decline of antiquity and the slowly emerging Western world which occupies a key position. However, today I prefer to follow the example of a Latin American author, Dominican intellectual Pedro Henriques Ureña, whose approach favors contextualizing literature within a wider selection of texts, both temporally and geographically, and who characterizes it as one of the manifestations of a Latin legacy. Ureña was a transnational man who lived in Mexico, the USA, and Argentina, and who, even during the period of the so-called literary vanguards, published 6 ensayos en busca de nuestra expresión, six essays in search of our expression, in 1928. And in this book, which was contemporaneous with Oswald de Andrade's Cannibalist Manifesto and Mário de Andrade's Macunaíma, Ureña defends his thesis of a long-standing Latin affiliation with geographically different European centers. And I quote, "Let's accept frankly as inevitable this complex situation. When we express ourselves, there will be within us, along with the unique part that's ours, born of our lives, sometimes as an indigenous heritage, another substantial portion, even if it is just the framework that we received from Spain. I will take this further. Not only do we write in the language of Castile, but we belong to the Romance group of countries, the Romance linguistic family that still constitutes a community, a cultural unit, descendant from that which Rome organized under its power. We belong, according to the much repeated phrase of Sarmiento's, to the Roman Empire. In terms of literature, since the Romance languages gained a full life of their own, the Romance community has never lacked a center, the successor of the Eternal City. From the 11th to the 14th centuries, it was France, initially oscillating between the north and the south of the country. With the Renaissance, it was the turn of Italy. Then, for a brief period, the center tended to be situated in Spain. From Louis XIV onwards, it was located in France again. Many times, the Romance community extended its influence to foreign regions, and we know how Paris governed Europe and briefly the two Americas in the 18th century. But from the beginning of the 19th century, rival regions in open and lasting opposition emerged. Even politically, we were born and grew up in the Romance community. Antonio Caso identifies with effective precision the three events in Europe whose influence in our peoples was decisive: the discovery, which was a Spanish event, the Renaissance, which was Italian, and the Revolution, which was French. The Renaissance only partially took shape in Spain, in cultural forms that would be transplanted to the New World. The Revolution was the forerunner of our wars of independence. The three events belong to Romance peoples. We do not have a direct relationship with the Reformation, nor with the constitutional evolution of England, and even the independence and the Constitution of the United States gained prestige among us only thanks to the propaganda that they received in France. End of quotation. Of course, we also know that amongst the long-standing meanings of the term literature itself, there is that derived from the Latin language, which goes from litere, letters, to literatura, and then to all the corresponding words in Western languages, such as literatura, Portuguese and Spanish, literature, English, literatur, German, literature, French, letteratura, Italian, among others, giving the term an intrinsic association with the written word. But we also know that after national adjectives associated with this term were established, Brazilian literature, Irish literature, French literature, German literature, etc., these adjectives gained an enormous semantic force from the 19th century onwards. As regards the histories of Brazilian literature, perhaps we can say that their purpose was often to create a narrative of a before and an after whose central pivot was the emergence of the national. Therefore, the recent questioning of the centrality of the national affects the sense of these histories for today's reader and is linked to the emergence of other theories and ways of seeing the past. As regards the strategies for the assertion of a national identity in post-colonial Brazil, to begin with, any construct that legitimized itself as an extension of a traditional history was impossible. Because, differently from Portugal, there was no previous memory of greatness or of national destiny in Brazil. As many other countries, since the long-standing memory previously in force was that of the colonial power, after independence, the need arose to emphasize difference and autonomy, to produce another form of post-colonial historicity, starting from a point of view presented as national, which would even reinterpret the past in order to look for the origins of present-day nations. But it's important to say that the formulation of new ideas about the emerging sense of nationality creatively appropriated certain European concepts and ideas, although at the precise moment that nationalist conceptions were being elaborated in the 19th century, this was not clear to those participating in the process. The language and the circumstances in which these ideas and concepts were processed, being shaped by local particularities and interests, gave rise to a distinct direction for the post-colonial nation-state. Although European post-Enlightenment and universalist ideas marked the national project, not only in Brazil, these imported concepts did not have the same meaning in Brazil as in their original context. That is to say, they were no longer the same since they were transformed in relation to local interests, which emphasized certain aspects and chose to eliminate other, thus giving rise to a distinct configuration. In general, the Europe that the colonies and the ex-colonies constructed in their imaginary, and in relation to which they positioned themselves, whether as heirs or as deniers of it, is also a non-European construction, in which the supposed originary concept and ideas of the old world could be used both to justify colonialism as well as to serve as the basis for emancipatory movements. In the specific case of literature, the post-colonial perspective aimed at contesting that of the former colonial power also gave rise to the view that a supposed literary imitation of the latter should be overcome in order to achieve a presumed state of autonomy. To some extent, this perspective also resulted in attributing to the former colonial power an absolute identity which supposedly gave rise to imitations in other territories. It is also common for an ex-colony to attribute an absolute identity to the former colonial power, which it is presumed the colony from which it is presumed the colony derived its identity in the past, an identity which should be rejected in post-colonial state. But no identity is absolute, impervious to other cultures, complete in its own. Indeed, even the colonial powers, in fact, principally such places, are melting pots which contain contributions from the colonies themselves. If a certain colonial perspective signified culturally valuing the contribution of the colonial power and devaluing that of the colony, it must be remembered that, beginning with the economy, there was a continuing relationship of connection and interdependence between the two. In this sense, there are echoes of a line of thinking, even present among Brazilian literary historians in the 20th century, which is based on the following basic premise. In the colonial period, Brazilian literature allegedly first imitated Portuguese literature. Then, with independence and the emergence of Romanticism, it began to develop its own voice, autonomous, individual, and so on. Of course, this kind of opinion flourished in different areas of thinking, giving rise, for example, to the notion that there were universally determined and determinable stages that societies had to reach in order to become developed. Societies that did not pass through these different stages and thus still have not attained a level of progress were accordingly thought to be less modern and requiring a period of preparation, transformation, and patience before they could be recognized. After Romanticism began to combat the poetics of imitation and emulation and gave a negative view of the tradition of choosing a certain group of authors and works as models to be followed, at the same time as was being emphasized the need to create works that reflected not the previous textual paradigm, but the supposed unique and original personality of the writer and the country to which he or she belonged, there also emerged a regulatory parameter for literary production. Judged according to this parameter, the poems of archaism, for example, came to be seen as lacking in creativity, and emphasis was placed on the implicit mimeticism in the accommodation of the text to neoclassical models of writing, from which the rules for producing Arcadian poetry were said to be derived, and in the light of which they were approved or rejected in the 18th century. The concept of mimeticism also serves to create the idea that the former colonies always produced a posteriori, in accordance with models imported from the colonial power, ignoring the fact that a certain synchrony existed in literary production, not only between former colonies and former colonial powers, but also between the latter as a whole and other nations in different historical moments. In any event, moving forward in time, if we examine the thinking of the literary vanguards of the early 20th century, we can observe that they often recycled and radicalized elements already present in Romanticism. If, on the one hand, up to the 18th century, in the poetics of imitation and emulation, it was clear that there was a canon of authors and works that, as a consequence of being exemplary, served as a model, on the other, principally after Romanticism, there emerged a very different notion of artistic production. Whereas the previous poetics gave value to the past, to where it looked for an example and model, the Romantics valued the aesthetics of the expression of the authorial eye, the presence of the authorial eye in the origin of the work, the presence of the writer in opposition to the press of his art. This polarization would continue into the following century. The fight against the neoclassical norms of the Romantic period is waged, amongst other means, by alleging that the very presupposition of producing a new classicism, with its notion of exemplarity and the use of the classics as a model, was not appropriate, since a new age demanded a new poetics. A poetics of today would be better than that of yesterday, by very definition. This is also a common trait of 20th century vanguards, which declare as obsolete all previous literary production and propose a new literature, their own, as the only one of value. To a certain extent, what the more radical artistic vanguards of the early 20th century did was to produce a certain description of aspects of the past in order to deny them, selecting from this description the aspects in relation to which they wanted to define their difference. On creating this image of the past in order to oppose themselves to it, a relationship was also constructed, which could be disputed, first by questioning what was chosen to constitute the past, analyzing the interests that presided over the choices that were made, and finally by concluding that, by definition, the artistic production of the present, by contrast with or by rejection of the artistic production of the past, in some way the vanguards also echo the voice that they disagree with. Why? Because when you attribute to any literary paradigm the function of model, the latter can be positive or negative. Negative models are those that we wish to avoid, those we wish to oppose ourselves to or be different from. However, they do not cease to be models. In other words, if you want to show your difference in relation to a negative model, it continues to be your referent, even if only so that you avoid it, confront it, or fail to repeat it. If we wanted to find another key to unlock the relationship of early 20th century vanguards with the literatures that had gone before, perhaps we could, instead of trying to ignore the links between the two, consider these vanguards as having a different relationship with that literature. In fact, many groups from early 20th century still had as their point of reference authors and literary works from the past, but not as examples or models to be followed. Since the self-image of the vanguardist is strongly marked by the idea of his/her alleged autonomy and brilliant individuality, he or she does not feel self-conscious about treating inherited paradigms with respect. If we want to hazard a generalization, we could argue that there is a large group of 20th century artists who appropriate tradition in a playful and arbitrary way in accordance with the most momentary interests of the artistic structure that they create. In this way, it seems that replacing what was proposed in Western artistic practice until at least the first half of the 18th century, in other words, replacing regularity and the iterative nature of emulation of the practices of imitation that successively appeared, but brought with them a certain comforting sense of return to an already familiar sphere, a new agenda emerges, where even the integration of the already familiar aspires to include something of the unforeseen, the random, and the contingent. Can we say that this art of the present, without the guarantee of a regular and stable relationship with the past, loses entirely any pretension to regularity, iterability, or recursiveness? Perhaps it's more appropriate to argue that the incorporation of new elements into the artistic process itself can also constitute a form of regularity, reiteration, recursiveness, or tradition, even if only for a short duration. In the Brazilian case, instead of continuing to look for European origins in order to find the elements that would later be imitated, perhaps it would be more productive to study the reception of these elements in Brazil. In other words, if the cultural project configured in the supposed origins is not predominantly determined by an export preoccupation in its very place of origin, Portugal, France, and so on, but by the reasoning, interests, and motivations of the cultural producers who chose what suits, adjusts, or harmonizes with its need and interests in the context of cultural reception in the ex-colonies, then greater attention must be given to the latter. This context of reception is in some way made up of public networks of meaning in which symbolically mediated interpretations emerge, including interpretations about what the place of origin in question signifies. We know that neither the real Portugal, nor the real France, nor the real Europe correspond to either the image of the colonial power or that of the absolute origin of emancipatory thought that served as basis for the decolonization movements. But it's not a question of Portugal, France, or Europe as such, but rather of the meanings attributed to these places in the reception context. In the different historical moments in which the appropriation and circulation of cultural elements from abroad took place, the sentence is not good, but it's not a question of Portugal, France, or Europe as such, but rather of the meanings attributed to these places in the reception context in the different historical moments in which the appropriation and circulation of cultural elements from abroad took place. Thus, the interests that affected the importation of these elements can be studied. The very context in relation to which writers and readers in Brazil interpret their experience in the text that they read, as well as direct their actions, is always in some way derived from locally rooted preconceptions that in some way contribute to the choices made. Of course, we know that attempts to theorize what happens when cultural elements that supposedly came from another place are incorporated into a given society are always problematic and complex. Such attempts have given rise over the years to a heated debate in the emergence, continuation, alteration, or substitution of conceptual terms, which in a particular way engaged with and related to certain existing references at the given historical moment, sometimes even generating apologies for doing so. Now we are going to see some examples. When Fernando Ortiz Fernandes, in his classic work Contrapunteio Cubano del Tabaco y del Azúcar, it was published first in 1940, used the term transculturation, transculturación, for the first time, he apologized for the neologism and explained that his intention was to replace, at least in part, the term acculturation, which at that time was gaining currency in anthropological terminology. And I quote, "We chose the word transculturation to express the extremely varied phenomena that originate in Cuba as a result of the highly complex transmutation of cultures that can be found there, without the knowledge of which it is impossible to understand the evolution of the Cuban nation, both in its economic aspect and in the institutional, juridical, ethical, religious, artistic, linguistic, psychological, sexual, and all remaining aspects of national life." In the case of the arrival of the Spanish in Cuba, Ortiz draws attention to the fact that they were removed from their original environment and transplanted to the New World. As later, waves of Africans from all coastal areas would also be, along with indigenous people from the continent, Jews, Portuguese, Anglo-Saxons, French, North Americans, and even Chinese from Macau, Canton, and other regions. For Ortiz, every immigrant in the New World was transformed into an individual uprooted from his native land, who experienced a critical, dual-edged moment of ill-adjustment and readjustment, of disculturation or exculturation, of acculturation or inculturation, and finally a process of synthesis or transculturation, and that's where the word comes from. He argued that transculturation amounted to this process of syncretism, which in turn was a product of the encounter in Cuba between these different cultures transplanted in the New World, where both for those who were arriving and for those who were already there would have to be a readjustment in order to adapt to the local circumstances, which were also altered by the impact of this cultural encounter. The Uruguayan critic Ángel Rama responded with a theoretical critique of Ortiz's work in the form of the publication Writing Across Cultures, Narrative Transculturation in Latin America. He drew attention to the fact that, amongst other factors, the idea of originality in the literature of the Americas after Romanticism was akin to the notion of put forth by Andrés Bello, namely an originality that stemmed from the representativeness of the region from which the literature emerged, since it saw itself as different from the society of the colonial power, whether as a result of the physical environment or ethnic composition, or whether because of its different stage of development in relation to what was considered the only model of progress, the European model. Antônio Cândido. This is probably the most famous Brazilian critic of the last century. Antônio Cândido, in a famous essay from 1969, wrote that in the choice of expressive tools with which to create literary works, there's always a degree of dependence in relation to what is already in circulation and to the hierarchies of an international system in which source countries generate, in his view, a dependency. This dependency, in his opinion, when considered in relation to the works produced by the dependent, is, and I quote, a form of participation in and contribution to a cultural universe to which we belong, which goes beyond nations and continents, permitting the reversibility of experiences and the circulation of values. It is no coincidence, then, that one of Cândido's favorite colleagues, Roberto Schwartz, wrote a famous text about the circulation of ideas, significantly entitled Misplaced Idea. This is translated by John Gladstone and is published by Verso in London. which deals with the importation of liberal European ideas and their embedding in 19th century Brazil, a context in which these ideas, if taken in their original European sense, he argued, entered into open contradiction with a social system that was still dominated by rural landowners and slavery, giving rise to, that's his expression, to an ideological comedy. Silviano Santiago, in an essay originally written in 1971, states that Latin America establishes its place on the map of Western civilization thanks to a movement that gives new meaning to the pre-established elements that the Europeans exported to the New World. In Santiago's view, the practice of permanently looking for sources and influences entrenched in academia restricts itself to mistakenly emphasizing a supposed lack of imagination among cultural producers who are allegedly obliged, due to a lack of homegrown traditions, to appropriate models put in circulation by the colonial power. This emphasis, he argues, reduced to the creation of Latin American cultural producers to the condition of parasitic works because they fed off others without adding anything of their own, thus drawing on the likely brilliancy and prestige of the source. According to Santiago, the Latin American text, as a second text, is organized on the basis of a silent and unfaithful meditation on the first text. And the reader of that first text, when transformed into a writer, is proactive. He says, I quote, "He tries to expose the original model in its limitations, in its weaknesses, in its lacunae, disarticulating and rearticulating it in accordance with his intentions, according to his own ideological direction, his vision of the theme initially presented by the original. The writer works on another text and almost never exaggerates the role that the reality that surrounds him can represent in his work. In this sense, the criticisms that are often leveled at the alienation of the Latin American writer, for example, are pointless and even ridiculous. If he only talks about his own life experience, his text goes unnoticed by his contemporaries. It is necessary that he first learn to speak the language of the colonial power in order to subsequently combat it better. The work of literary critics should above all be characterized by an analysis of the use that the writer makes of a text or a literary technique that belongs in the public domain, of the advantage that he takes of it. And this analysis should be completed by a description of the techniques that the same author creates in his aggressive advance on the original model, breaking down the foundations that held it up as a unique object that was impossible to reproduce. The imaginary in the realm of neo-colonialism can no longer be that of ignorance or naivety, fed by a simplistic manipulation of the information offered by the immediate experience of the author, but rather will increasingly consolidate itself as one piece of writing created on top of another. The second work, since it in general entails a critique of the previous one, asserts itself with the demystifying violence of anatomical charts that strip bare the architecture of the human body. End of quoting. As far as more wide-ranging proposals are concerned, which insert culture and literature into larger contexts, it's also important to acknowledge Benjamin Abdallah Jr.'s contribution to theoretical perspectives on the circulation of ideas. He proposes a comparative approach that can extend our knowledge of the different historical processes that societies go through and I quote, "in a roof dialogue involving the literatures of all regions, where we discuss what we have in common and how we differ." End of quote. Abdallah Jr. considers a socio-cultural awareness of the place where the critic is situated imperative to literary criticism, because it is from this place of access to network dynamics tending towards supranationality that he speaks, and it is from this place that one can seek to overcome purely localistic attitudes, contributing towards communal engagement with greater political reach, since they are based on a historical experience rooted in the place where they are created. For pragmatic reasons, Abdallah Jr. believes that the first stage of such communal engagement can take place within a Luso-Afro-Brazilian context, since there is a history of cultural and literary circulation. He also gives priority to the Iberian literary context, with an emphasis on Latin America, where such engagement involves diverse blocks of countries with common interests. Thus, as we have seen in the various dimensions of the theoretical reasoning involved in their respective works, to some extent, all these theoreticians have included among their interests the ways in which a given history of cultural element, with an alleged origin in a certain place, inserts itself in another place. All of them, therefore, have sought to reflect on what is at stake in literary and cultural circulation. To conclude, we can also consider another alternative put forth by Machado de Assis in chapter 37 of Esaú e Jacó, significantly entitled About an Inopportune Thought. And I quote, and I will end after this: "Ideas themselves do not always keep the name of the father. Many appear as orphans, born of nothing and of no one. Each one takes them from the next, makes of them what they can, and carries them to the marketplace, where all take them for their own." Many thanks.